This is a true story from American history that most people were never taught in school. In 1921, inside a black neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, called Greenwood, there were black-owned banks, black-owned hospitals, and black millionaires at a time when most black Americans in this country could not even open a bank account at a white-owned bank. 48 hours later, every single block of it was burned to the ground. And the strange part is not that it burned. The strange part is that almost nobody outside that community was ever taught it existed in the first place. Here is the detail that changes everything once you hear it. It was not destroyed because it failed. It was destroyed because it worked. The people who built it were not handed a single dollar from the institutions that were supposed to serve them. Banks closed the door in their faces, so they built their own banks. Hospitals turned them away, so they built their own hospitals. And what they proved in less than 2 decades about what they were capable of building from nothing is the exact reason this story was buried for almost 100 years. This is not a legend, and it is not folklore. This is a documented chapter of American history with real names, real dates, real dollar amounts, surviving newspaper archives, and survivor testimony recorded on tape decades later. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly why so few people were ever taught about it, and why what happened in Greenwood still matters right now. Stay with me, because this is the kind of history that once you know it, you cannot unknow it. Let's go back to the beginning, to a patch of land in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that almost nobody remembers existed before 1906. At the start of the 20th century, Oklahoma was a strange and dangerous frontier. It had just become a state in 1907, and it carried within it the harsh segregation laws of the Jim Crow South, layered on top of a newly forming oil economy that was making some men unimaginably rich. Black Americans arriving in Oklahoma in this period were met with a simple, brutal reality. They could not bank where white residents banked. They could not be treated in the hospitals built for white patients, and they could not eat in most of the restaurants, sleep in most of the hotels, or shop freely in most of the stores. So in the city of Tulsa, a roughly 35-block district just north of the railroad tracks began to take shape, and it would become known as Greenwood. The man most credited with its founding was a former farmhand and entrepreneur named O.W. Gurley. In 1906, Gurley purchased a piece of land in this district and made a decision that would echo for generations. He announced that he would only sell or lease that land to other black families and business owners. He built one of the first structures in the area, a small rooming house, and he is widely credited as the founder of what would become the most prosperous black community in the history of the United States. Alongside Gurley stood another towering figure, J.B. Stratford, a man born into slavery in Kentucky who went on to earn a law degree and who arrived in Tulsa believing something radical for his time, that black Americans had a better chance at economic independence if they pooled their resources together rather than scattering their dollars into a white economy that refused to serve them as equals. Stratford built the Stratford Hotel, a 54-room luxury hotel, considered at the time to be one of the largest black-owned hotels in the entire country, complete with a dining hall, a saloon, and a pool hall on its lower level. Now, here is where the story moves from interesting to extraordinary. What happened over the following 15 years was not just the growth of a neighborhood, it was the construction of something close to a self-contained economy. By the late 1910s and into 1921, the Greenwood District contained, by various documented counts, somewhere around 200 black-owned businesses operating within roughly 35 square blocks. There were grocery stores, and there were 2 newspapers, the Tulsa Star, and the Oklahoma Sun, giving the community its own independent press, run and edited entirely by black journalists, covering local business, politics, and achievement in a way that no white-owned paper in Tulsa ever would. There were movie theaters, including the Dreamland Theater, owned by businessman John Williams and his wife Lula Williams, which seated several hundred people and showed films along with live musical performances, becoming one of the social centers of the entire district. There were law offices and doctors' offices, including the practice of Dr. A.C. Jackson, who was reportedly described by one of the era's most famous surgeons, Dr. Charles Mayo of the Mayo Clinic, as the most able black surgeon in America. Jackson had trained extensively and built a reputation that, under different circumstances, in a different America, would have made him a nationally recognized name in medicine. There were pharmacies, barber shops, beauty salons, tailor shops, billiard halls, churches, a school system, a public library branch, and a bus and taxi service that moved residents efficiently through the district. Beyond Gurley and Stratford, the district was shaped by a wide network of entrepreneurs whose names rarely made it into national textbooks. Simon Barry, who built a transportation empire in Greenwood that included a jitney or shared taxi service, and later an actual airplane charter service, becoming by some accounts one of the first black-owned aviation businesses in the country. And Mabel Little, a businesswoman who ran a successful beauty shop and later became one of the most outspoken voices preserving the community's history after the destruction that was about to come. What made this network powerful was not any single business, it was the density of it, block after block of black-owned enterprise feeding into one another. A grocer buying his suits from a black tailor 2 doors down, a doctor banking his earnings at a black-owned bank, a hotel guest eating breakfast at a black-owned diner before catching a ride from a black-owned taxi service. And running underneath all of it, like the bloodstream of the entire community, was something local economists at the time pointed to with genuine astonishment. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If you were told that every dollar earned in your neighborhood stayed inside that neighborhood for weeks before it ever left, how different do you think your community would look today? Because that is essentially what was happening in Greenwood. Because black residents were locked out of white-owned banks, hotels, and shops, the dollars that black workers and professionals earned had nowhere else to go. They were spent at black-owned grocery stores, black-owned tailors, black-owned hotels, and black-owned pharmacies again and again and again in a tight, repeating loop. This circulation pattern is part of why the district came to be known nationally, even by Booker T. Washington, who is widely credited with popularizing the term as Black Wall Street. Some historical accounts and oral histories from Greenwood descendants describe that single dollar circulating locally dozens of times before it ever left the community. Some estimates put that figure as high as 36 times, while a dollar in many white communities of the era was estimated to leave the local economy within a single day. Whether the precise number was in the dozens or somewhere close to it, the underlying truth, confirmed by economic historians studying the district, is the same. Greenwood had built something incredibly rare for any community in America at that time, black or white, a nearly closed-loop local economy that multiplied wealth internally before a single cent crossed back into the segregated white side of town. Multiple black families in Greenwood became millionaires in today's dollars through real estate, oil-adjacent business dealings, and the sheer compounding effect of that internal spending loop. This was not charity. This was not a handout. This was financial engineering, built by people the official banking system had locked out, using nothing but each other. So here's a question worth asking yourself before we go any further. Knowing what you just learned about how that local dollar circulated, what do you think a system like that, if it had been allowed to keep growing for another 50 years, could have become? Drop your honest answer in the comments, because by the end of this video, you may find yourself revisiting that number. Now, we have to talk about what happened next, because what happened on May 31st and June 1st of 1921 is one of the most devastating and, for decades, most deliberately silenced events in American history. It began, as so many tragedies of that era did, with an accusation. On May 30th, 1921, a young black teenager named Dick Rowland, who worked shining shoes, entered an elevator in the Drexel Building in downtown Tulsa, operated by a young white elevator attendant named Sarah Page. What exactly happened inside that elevator has never been definitively established. The most widely accepted historical theory is that Rowland either tripped or stepped on Page's foot, causing her to scream, which was then overheard by a store clerk nearby. Rowland was arrested the following day, May 31st, on suspicion of assault. That same afternoon, the Tulsa Tribune, a white-owned local newspaper, published an inflammatory front-page article about the arrest. Surviving fragments and witness accounts describe the headline as alleging an assault, and some accounts reference an editorial that allegedly called for a lynching that night, though the original full edition of that particular page has never been recovered, as it was reportedly removed from surviving archived copies of the paper. By that evening, a large and growing crowd of white residents had gathered outside the Tulsa County Courthouse where Rowland was being held, demanding that he be handed over. A group of armed black men, many of them World War I veterans, arrived at the courthouse as well, intent on protecting Rowland from a lynching that increasingly looked imminent. A confrontation broke out near the courthouse steps. A shot was fired, no one knows for certain by whom, and in the chaos that followed, gunfire erupted between the two groups. Within hours, what had begun as a courthouse standoff exploded into one of the most violent and coordinated assaults on a black community in United States history. Through the overnight hours of May 31st into the early morning of June 1st, mobs of white residents, in many documented accounts purportedly joined or deputized by local law enforcement officials, swept into the Greenwood District. Homes were looted and set ablaze. Businesses were broken into and burned to the ground, block after block. Survivors and later investigators described private planes being used to drop incendiary devices onto buildings and fleeing residents from above, making this, according to many historians, one of the only instances of aerial bombardment ever carried out on American civilians on U.S. soil. By the time the smoke cleared on the afternoon of June 1, 1921, the numbers were staggering. Somewhere between 35 and over 100 people were killed, with many historians and a 2001 State Commission report suggesting the true death toll may never be fully known, given how many victims were reportedly buried in unmarked mass graves, several of which have only begun to be formally investigated and excavated in the last few years. More than 1,000 homes were destroyed. Insurance claims filed by Greenwood residents after the massacre, totaling well over $1.5 million in 1921 currency, which would equate to tens of millions of dollars today, were almost entirely denied, with insurance companies citing riot exclusion clauses. Thousands of residents were left homeless, many forced into internment-style camps set up by the city, some held there for days or weeks before being released, often only if a white employer vouched for them. J.B. Stratford, the very man who built the 54-room hotel meant to be a monument to black self-sufficiency, fled Tulsa in the aftermath to avoid being lynched, and was indicted by a grand jury for inciting the riot, not the white mob that burned his hotel to the ground, but Stratford himself for the act of organizing armed black men to protect a teenager from a lynching. He would not be formally exonerated until 1996, 75 years later, and his conviction was not officially pardoned until 2007. Here's something worth pausing on. The The man who built one of the great symbols of black economic achievement in America was legally branded a criminal for trying to defend his own community, while the people who burned that achievement to the ground walked away with no convictions at all. What do you think it says about a justice system that wrote the story that way? And this is where the second half of the story becomes, in some ways, even more chilling than the massacre itself. Because what happened over the following decades was not simply a tragedy that was forgotten. In many documented cases, it was a tragedy that was actively, deliberately erased. City records related to the massacre went missing for decades. Newspaper archives, including that critical Tulsa Tribune edition from May 31, 1921, were reportedly stripped from microfilm records held at the Public Library and the Oklahoma Historical Society, with the relevant page physically absent from preserved copies. For nearly 50 years, Oklahoma school curriculums made little to no mention of the massacre at all. Entire generations of Oklahomans, black and white, grew up in the same state where this happened and were never formally taught it occurred. It would not be until 1996, 75 years after the massacre, that the Oklahoma State Legislature formally created a commission to investigate what actually happened. A commission that would not deliver its full report until the year 2001. Some historians and survivors' descendants have pointed to a deeper, more uncomfortable possibility behind this decades-long silence, that the erasure was not just about shame over the violence itself, but about something else entirely, a reluctance to confront just how successful Greenwood had become before it was destroyed. It is worth being fair to the full historical picture here, because historians do not all agree on a single simple explanation, and that disagreement is itself part of the story. Some scholars argue the massacre was, at its root, an act of racial violence like so many others of that era, a mob responding to a rumor with the same brutal pattern seen in other cities during what is sometimes called the Red Summer period around 1919, where racial tensions, economic competition, and post-war anxieties collided violently in city after city. Other historians point specifically to Greenwood's visible wealth, the brick buildings, the hotel, the doctor's offices, as a factor that made this particular massacre unusually organized, unusually well-armed, and in the eyes of some researchers, unusually targeted toward the destruction of black-owned property and financial documents specifically, rather than simply violence against people. Both readings can be true at the same time. The massacre may have been ignited by the same racial hatred seen elsewhere in the country during that period, while also being intensified and made more thorough in its destruction by the specific, visible success of what stood in its path. Because think about what the existence of Black Wall Street actually proved. It proved that when given even a sliver of economic room to operate, when forced by segregation into relying entirely on each other, a black community in the heart of Jim Crow America could build wealth, build infrastructure, and build generational opportunity faster than almost any other community in the country at that time. That is not a comfortable story for a system built on the assumption of dependency to sit with. So a question worth sitting with, and maybe leaving in the comments below. Do you think a story like Greenwood gets buried mainly out of shame for the violence, or out of something closer to fear of what its success proved? There is no single right answer here. Historians themselves are divided, but it is worth thinking through for yourself. What we do know, beyond dispute, is the scale of what was lost, not just in property, but in trajectory. Economists and historians studying generational wealth in America have repeatedly pointed to events like the Tulsa Massacre as case studies in what is sometimes called a wealth shock, A single, violent interruption capable of erasing not just one generation's assets, but the compounding wealth that would have been built by their children and their children's children for 100 years afterward. Some modern economic estimates of the property losses alone in Greenwood, adjusted into today's dollars, range into the tens of millions. But the harder number to calculate, the number that may matter most, is what that wealth would have multiplied into by 2026 had it simply been allowed to keep compounding the way it was before that night in May. For decades, survivors who lived through it carried the story largely in silence, some out of trauma, some out of fear, some because for most of their lives, almost no one outside their own families was willing to listen. It would take recorded oral histories, the 2001 State Commission report, and a renewed wave of public attention nearly a century later for the broader country to begin reckoning with what had actually happened in Greenwood. In 2020 and 2021, around the centennial of the massacre, excavation efforts in Tulsa began formally searching for and identifying remains believed to be linked to mass graves from the massacre, an effort that remarkably is still ongoing. There is one more part of this story that deserves to be told clearly, because it is, in its own way, just as remarkable as everything that came before it. Despite losing nearly everything, despite the denied insurance claims, despite the city of Tulsa briefly attempting to pass new fire and owning ordinances after the massacre that would have made it nearly impossible to rebuild Greenwood in its original footprint, ordinances that were eventually overturned after black attorneys, including B.C. Franklin, fought them in court from a tent because their original law office had also burned to the ground. Many Greenwood residents, with little outside help and almost no insurance payouts, began rebuilding within months. By the mid-1920s, against extraordinary odds, parts of Greenwood had been reconstructed, and by some historical accounts, the district reached a second peak of economic activity later in that same decade, before the broader pressures of the Great Depression and later large-scale urban renewal and highway construction projects in the 1960s and 1970s, which physically cut through the heart of the district, contributed to its long, slow decline over the following decades. That rebuilding effort, quieter and far less discussed than the massacre itself, is in some ways the clearest proof of everything this video has been arguing. The destruction did not erase the underlying capability that built Greenwood in the first place. It only delayed it. So let's bring this all the way back to where we started. Black Wall Street was not a myth, and it was not an exaggeration passed down through folklore. It was a documented, verifiable, extraordinary demonstration of what happens when a community, denied access to the institutions meant to serve everyone, decides to build its own instead. Its own banks, its own hospitals, its own newspapers, its own hotels, its own schools, its own economy. And it was not destroyed because that experiment failed. The historical record, the property values, the dollar circulation, the list of doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs who built it all point to the same uncomfortable truth. It was destroyed because it worked, and because what it proved about what was possible was to some more dangerous than the violence it would take to erase it. Before we close this out, here is one more thing worth thinking about for yourself. If a single 35-block district with no outside investment and no support from the institutions that were supposed to serve everyone could generate millionaires, hospitals, and a self-sustaining economy in under 2 decades, what do you think that says about the systems, even today, that determine which communities get access to capital and which ones are told to wait? You do not need to answer that in the comments if you would rather sit with it quietly, but if you do have thoughts, this is exactly the kind of conversation worth having in the comments below. If you are watching this video right now, there is a real chance you are a descendant, directly or indirectly, of the same generation that built Greenwood, or communities like it across the country. Communities that also understood, in the harshest terms imaginable, that no one was coming to hand them anything. This is not just history. For many watching this, it is inheritance. Not necessarily property or bank accounts, most of those were burned along with everything else, but something less tangible and, in its own way, more permanent. Proof. Proof that the capacity to build something out of nothing, to turn exclusion into independence, was never in question. It was demonstrated on a 35-block stretch of land in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in under 20 years by people who started with absolutely nothing handed to them. That is the record they tried to bury for almost 100 years, and now that you know it, it cannot be unburied again. If this is the first time you are hearing the full story of Black Wall Street, told with the names, the dates, and the documents behind it, let me know in the comments below. And if you think this is a piece of American history that deserves to be taught far more widely than it currently is, say so, because conversations like this one are exactly how stories like this stop being buried. Subscribe if you want more deep, document-grounded history like this, because there are more stories like Greenwood out there. Communities that built, communities that were erased, and communities whose record is still waiting to be properly told. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.